Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. This is going to be the first video talking about genetics, or the patterns of inheritance. I'm very excited to go into this with you. Now, before we go into the details, there are a few basic terms I'd like you to know. If you're not familiar with these terms, I'd encourage you to use some of the resources that are linked from the online site to go learn more about them. So I'll introduce these terms very briefly because I'll be using them repeatedly throughout this video and other later videos. So the basic terms I'd like you to know are first that of DNA, that's short for deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA, as many of you know, is the hereditary material that is used by most species and is comprised of nucleotides or building blocks. Those building blocks are labeled A, C, G, and T. So there's 4 different forms that are commonly used in DNA, and that's how they're often abbreviated, A, C, G, and T. Now, genes are the fundamental units of biological information, and they're made of DNA. Typically, a gene will be on the order of a couple of hundred or maybe a few thousand DNA nucleotides long. So these pieces put together to make this particular set of instruction. Okay? Chromosomes are organized packages of DNA. We humans, many of you probably know, have 23 pairs of chromosomes, the most famous pair being that of the X and Y, which determine our gender. Now, these packages bear genes along their length. These are very long stretches of DNA. They are millions of bases long typically, and they have genes along them. So basically, they're the scaffolding for genes within our body. And finally, the genome is the entire set of DNA instructions in a cell. So all the chromosomes and any other material like that is the genome, or you often hear reference to the human genome. So I hope you already appreciate this, but I'll say it nonetheless. Genetics is very cool, as illustrated by this handsome young man right here playing with genetics. So genetics is this code that's found inside every single cell of your body, right? And it affects everything about you. It affects how you feel, it affects how you learn, it affects how you look, it affects everything. It affects how long you'll live, it affects what diseases you have. I mean, it's just amazing how much is affected by genetics. Now, when I say affected, I don't mean that it's completely explained by genetics, but genetics has a big effect on everything about you, and not just about you, but also about your pets. You know, in fact, why are your pets the particular species they are? They probably came from an egg that wasn't too dissimilar from the egg that you came from, but they changed into, over time, this, puppy or this kitten or something like that. Again, this is pretty cool. This is all within this code. Livestock, we can actually help better breed better cattle by understanding the genetic basis of traits. We can attack pests of our crops. We can attack parasites better within our body by understanding the various pieces of their genetics. And ultimately, and you'll see this later on in the course, we can understand evolution much better by having a good understanding of genetics. Now, poor Darwin was able to come up with the ideas of evolution by natural selection without having access to a lot of detailed genetics. But over time, in the last, over 150 years since his famous book was published, we've actually been able to support a lot of his theories in much more detail than he would have even dreamed of back in his day. So many of you have heard of DNA testing. This is a context in which genetics comes up repeatedly. In the media, we often see references to it in these particular 3 contexts. Paternity tests, trying to identify, among 2 possible dads, which one is actually the father of the baby. Now, sometimes you can tell because the kid looks far more like one potential father than the other, but you can do a DNA test even if the kid looks very intermediate and you can't really tell. It's often used in the context of criminal investigations, where we look for DNA at a place where a crime was collected, and then I try to identify who it was who actually committed the particular crime. Maybe interested to see who that is, by the way. And of course, DNA testing is often used in the case of forensics, that if they find a tooth, or they find some small bit of skin or something like that, can you actually identify who was there, who was the person? Or if there's a body that you can't identify very easily, again, DNA testing may be used to narrow down who that is. Now, these are examples that have been seen for the last several decades, for the last tens of years. More recently, we've seen much more exciting forms of DNA testing, and these come up in the context of personal genotyping services. Many companies offer these, 23andMe being just one example of companies that offer this, but what happens is individuals will pay the companies to study their DNA, typically from spit. So they'll spit a little bit into there, mail it off to the company. And what information do they get from this, from the personal genotyping service? Well, they get quite a bit. That for one single price from many of these companies, you'll get information on your ancestry. You can get to find out, where did your father's 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 father come from? Where did your mother's 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 come from? Do you have, does your lineage lead back to Asia? Does it lead back to South America? Does it, what part of the world does it come from? You can even potentially identify other relatives. Some of these companies actually offer things where if somebody's a relative who also did the DNA test, maybe they would let you, with your permission, hook up with them to actually get to meet them. The other thing that they'll tell you about is health. They will use the information in your genetic code to tell you your relative likelihood of getting particular diseases. Now, this is one that we're going to talk about extensively in this class because it's something that there's issues that you should be aware of. First, let's address the question of where do they get this information? How do they identify health risks associated with genes? Well, many of you see references to disease genes in the news. Here's a few headlines out there. Gene increases diabetes risk, scientists find. This is from 2006 in the New York Times. Researchers find big batch of breast cancer genes on the cable news network. Scientists spot genes behind heart disease, protecting it. This is a good one right here. This is a mutation protecting against Alzheimer's. So this is a particular gene variant that if you happen to have this variant, you're actually less likely to get Alzheimer's disease than if you don't have it. So these kinds of things come up all the time in the news. A lot of genes that have variants associated with disease or have alleles associated with disease have been genetically mapped, where people have found where these genes are in the genome. What chromosome and position are they? This picture shows you several genes identified from various chromosomes across the genome. So, for example, sickle cell anemia is known to be associated with this little stretch here of chromosome 11. The actual gene is known for that. Cystic fibrosis, there's a factor contributing to it there on chromosome 7. There's a lot of these disease genes that have been mapped to particular parts of the genome. And it's not just disease genes. A lot of other genes have come up in the news, sometimes kind of silly ones. Like, I love the name of this one. The fat gene was found by scientists. That was published in the Times. Gene for left-handedness is found. The gay gene has been found in female mice in Popular Science. Some of these are clearly sensationalized in the media, but there's some underlying truth. There's some gene that has a variant which seems to be associated with, for example, heart risk or being lean. Okay? The other thing that you often hear about is that there's some sort of raging debate between nature versus nurture. I love it when I'm sitting on the plane and somebody asks me, when I tell them I'm a geneticist, they say, well, where are you on the nature versus nurture controversy? That's just kind of silly. There is no real controversy. Pretty much any trait, not all, but pretty much any trait you look at has some contribution from genetics and some environmental effects as well. The other thing that comes up is that a lot of the genes that are identified don't always hold up. That, when further study is done, they can't replicate this effect of this particular variant being associated with this disease or trait or things like that. Now, it could be that there actually is a variant associated with it, but it only affects a certain subset of individuals and not others, maybe based on ethnic group or based on something else, or maybe there was just a flaw in the original study. So here's a couple of examples here. Scientists debunk so-called fat gene. And this next one is one of my favorite headlines ever. Exercise blocks effects of fat gene. I love that headline. That's so funny. The other one here, New York Times, breast cancer gene risk may be overstated. Well, in the upcoming videos, what I'd like to do, and basically for this first half of this course overall, is to get you all to understand how these genes are identified. How do we find risk factors associated with diseases like cancer or heart disease, things like that? And so these genes are made up of the genetic code, and people think, well, when we have a human genome sequence, we should be able to just look at it. The problem is when you look at it, you see ACGT. It doesn't come labeled with cancer or something like that. So what has to happen is we have to go through this process known as genetic mapping. Even when you have a fully sequenced genome, you have to go through this process of mapping to see which genes have variants associated with particular traits of interest. We'll get into this in a lot more detail in subsequent lectures, but I wanted to give you this brief introduction. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In this video, we'll be talking about some of the very basic history of and understanding of inheritance. And I'm referring specifically in this case to genetic inheritance. Now, if you think back hundreds of years ago, people understood that there was something being passed on from parents to offspring. This was true long before they knew anything about genes or anything about DNA being the genetic material or anything like that. Well, why is that? How did we know that there's some sort of information being passed on from parents to offspring? Well, the answer is quite simple. If you look around, people tend to look like their parents or their kids. So familial resemblance is obvious, that we all the time see people say, oh, you look far more like your kids than you do relative to somebody else. Now, some of that could be that you're in a common environment. You live in the same house or in the same community as your parents do. However, we don't see as much resemblance in families when you have adoptees. We might have some, but quite often you can have adopted kids that don't look at all similar to their parents. They also may have very little correlation in other traits such as dietary preferences or IQ, which is the intelligence coefficient, things like that. So how did people try to explain this? Well, Charles Darwin, attributed this familial resemblance to some unknown factor he referred to as a gemule. And there's a quote here, as you see on this slide, from a letter to Francis Galton. If I ask myself how you derive and where you place the innumerable gemules contained within the spermatozoa formed by a male animal during its whole life, note he said male, I cannot answer myself. Now, actually, there was some information at this point about genetic inheritance from the famous pea experiments by Gregor Mendel. However, Darwin did not know about these. Now, it's important to understand genetics, and it would have been actually very helpful for Darwin to understand genetics to help us understand the process of evolution as well. There's something that comes out if you don't really understand genetics that becomes a problem for evolution. So let's look at this. Imagine that you had some tall individuals in a population and some short individuals in a population. And let's say that offspring were always intermediate to the two parents. So if you have a tall parent, let's say somebody who's 6 foot, let's say a 6 foot tall mom and a 5 foot tall dad, would you be 5'6"? Would you be exactly in the middle? Well, let's hypothesize that that was true for a minute. Or as in this picture right here, let's imagine that white flowers and red flowers gave rise to pink flowers. What would happen if this happened over time, over and over again? Eventually, everybody in the population is going to come back to some sort of average. Basically, you'll lose all variation in the population. This is referred to as the problem of blending inheritance. Let me give you a numerical example just to illustrate this point. So here's the numerical example. Now let's imagine you're looking at height, or any sort of continuous trait. And let's say, for example, you're thinking 5 foot X inches, and the numbers depicted here are the number of inches after 5 feet. So we have here a dad who's 5'4", a mom who's 5'9", dad who's 5'5", mom who's 5'8", dad who's 5'2", mom who's 5'6". Okay, so basically any sort of continuous trait. In this case, we're having it range from 0 to 9. So each of these individuals is going to have a kid, and we're going to assume the kid has an exactly intermediate trait to the two parents. So if the dad is 5'4", mom is 5'9", the kid is 5'6½ inches. If the dad is 5'8", mom is dad is 5'5", mom is 5'8". Again, the kid is 6½ inches, etc. So look what's happened between the first generation and the second generation. In the first generation, we had a range from 0 to 9. In the second generation, we've lost a lot of this range. We're now going from 2 to 6.5. So what happens if we iterate this over multiple generations? Well, a lot more variation gets lost. So here I just took this person, put them there, this person, put them there, this one here, this one there, etc., etc. And you see, as we iterate this more, we initially had this range from 2 to 6.5, but as we take more and more averages across the population, the range has now gone down to 2.75 to 6.5 in generation 3, and even further in generation 4 to 2.875 to 5.875. So if we iterate this over and over again an infinite number of times, we will eventually lose all variation in the population. Everybody will be exactly intermediate and the same height. Now, if you don't have variation, then you can't actually have evolution by natural selection, because there's no trait being inherited that allows for greater survival or reproduction. Since everybody's the same, everybody presumably surviving or reproducing the same with respect to whatever it is they're inheriting. But more fundamentally, since when we look in any natural population, we do see variation, and we do see variation that appears to be heritable, this poses a problem for understanding heredity more generally. Now, one possible solution to this was tossed out. This was from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So this idea that variation in some way needs to be created or renewed within populations for evolution to happen. So what Lamarck suggested is something along the lines of what's called the inheritance of acquired character. Inheritance of acquired character. Now this right here is a quote from Lamarck's writing. The idea here is that basically if you use something, it then can grow and then that gets passed on to offspring. So some anecdotal examples would be something like a blacksmith. Blacksmith is using their muscles all the time to work with their metal. They tend to have these big muscles, and if you look, kids of blacksmiths often have these big muscles too. Same sort of thing may have been suggested for giraffes, that in stretching to reach the leaves on the trees, they stretch their necks up, and somehow this use of the neck and stretching it actually gets it to be passed on to the offspring, so they then had offspring that had slightly longer necks. This was the idea that was tossed out. Darwin actually adopted this idea for gemmules in some of his later editions of On the Origin of Species. Now, you may know that this is not exactly correct, and I'll show you one case where I messed up. If you go back to my 10th grade high school class, my teacher, Mr. Bennett, asked some questions. He said, if you were to cut someone's left arm off and they have kids, would they have one or two arms? That was one question on a quiz. The next question is, if you were to cut someone's left arm off and cut their kid's left arm off, repeating for 20 generations, would the 21st generation kid have one or two arms? Well, I got the first one correct because I said the answer was two. Because just because you lose an arm, there's plenty of people who lose an arm and have kids with two arms. But somehow I thought maybe this would get passed on if this happened over and over again. And this is much more along the lines of what Lamarck had believed. Now, that is not true. In fact, if you were to cut somebody's left arm off and repeat that for 20 generations, 21st generation kid would still have two arms. Now the reason for this, and the reason that variation is not in fact lost, the way I portrayed it in the context of blending inheritance, is because we have particulate inheritance. We are actually transmitting bits of genetic information that remain distinct in the offspring. We'll talk about this much more extensively in the next lecture, exactly how this works. But just to put a couple of points on this, we are not a simple copy of our parents, nor are we necessarily the midpoint of our parents. It is quite possible to have two tall parents have a short kid, or two short parents have a tall kid, irrespective of any sort of environmental or dietary effects, anything like that. You can also have blue-eyed offspring from brown-eyed parents. This is very frequently observed. And basically, traits can be masked. It's because these particulate inheritance pieces can be masked by other parts. Also, genetic diseases can crop up, or just new traits in general. It doesn't have to be disease. Now, all of this was known long before, very long before we knew that DNA carried this genetic code. And a lot of this comes back to this fellow here, Gregor Mendel, that we'll talk about in much more detail in the next set of lectures. Now, I do want to stress one point, that inheritance is actually similar across most animals and many plants and even fungi. Now, many species are diploid. This is a very important word for you to know. Diploid means that you have two copies of the entire genetic code in your body, right? You have one gene copy that came from one parent, and you have another gene copy that came from the other parent. Okay? Now, you're not intermediate, but you actually have these two distinct, complete sets of gene copies for every gene in your whole genome. Now, this is true not just for you, but again, for most animals, many plants and fungi. And in fact, many of the same proteins and structures are involved in inheritance in you as in various plants and fungi, and as well as other animals. And it's because of this that people tend to use model organisms to understand inheritance. We say model organisms, these are animals or plants that people work with, or fungi as well, that people work with to try to understand genetics. But we're not necessarily interested in them themselves, but we're using them to understand genetics more broadly because we presume that it applies very similarly across all species. So many of you know, for example, the famous fruit fly. People don't work on fruit flies because they love fruit flies or especially care about fruit flies or want to kill fruit flies. They use it because they're easy to work with in the laboratory. Same sorts of things for mouse, for xenopus frogs, for zebrafish, for this plant right here is called Arabidopsis thaliana. So this is why people use model organisms, because patterns of inheritance and the genes involved in inheritance tend to be the same across most living species. Now, let me just give you an idea of what's to come. Foreshadowing. So these are some questions to be thinking about. I'm not asking you them just now. So how do offspring get the genes from their parents? Basically, how do these single copies of all the genes in the genome from your dad and from your mom come together and fuse into what becomes your genome? And are traits controlled by one gene alone? Is there a single eye color gene? Is there a single diabetes gene? Is there a single cancer gene? Things like that. Or are there many genes that contribute to these traits? You can probably guess the answer to that one is the second. And finally, and this is again what I hope to be getting to you by the end of the genetics section, how do we find genes associated with traits? So we'll come back to these points, and I hope you'll join us. Thank you very much.